So I'm going to share my screen now and just take you through the pictures. So hopefully you can see, oops, you can see my main screen. So I'm talking about a new parable of the sower, and I've been involved in an organisation which is now attached to the Eden Project. We set up the National Wildflower Centre actually in 2000. At the same time, the Eden Project opened, so we were very much cousins in that sense. And sadly, when our Wildflower Centre closed in Liverpool 3 years ago, the Eden Project were very, very keen that our legacy continued, really. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of that journey, but also in terms of the opportunities and things that exist. The idea of the sower is a very personal one, and in practical terms, when people talk about seed and as a metaphor, it's forgotten, I think, that culture as a word really comes from the nurture of agriculture, and those subjects are really important, and we need to put the culture of the sower back in the landscape in terms of what we can do. We're very lucky in this country to have a rich heritage of semi-natural habitats, but in the past they have all been about culture, and so it's the importance connection to people that is so very special and important in terms of how we literally grow this message in practical terms. So you can see the Eden Project badge on there. It's wonderful to lend those energies to this kind of our own legacy. So I've been involved in kind of more scientific work in the past. This was something I did when I was just after being a student, in terms of a production we did for Natural England, which was called Flowers in the Grass, and was just about putting wildflowers amongst the grass, which, you know, a lot of counties everywhere, you travel through them. Cheshire is a classic example, but the green you see in the fields, there's really not very much there amongst it. So, and I come from Lincolnshire, which originally, apparently, in terms of Hoskins' history of the English landscape, was once the Meadow County of England, and certainly that is no more. We're left with these kind of pocket handkerchiefs in the midst of, you know, agricultural landscapes. So it's important to have a kind of scientific basis and understanding, but it's the way it links to the social, and also the fact that perhaps we've missed something. So, for example, our country, the United Kingdom, has probably the greatest concentration of naturalists in the world, and you know, we see the enthusiasm for that in Springwatch and all these programs. But in actual fact, all we've done really, apart from saving some very good when they did the original sort of Countryside and Wildlife Acts in the 1940s, 1947. Sadly, all we've done since then is log that decline, and we have to. Hopefully, this is a funny slide which really just logs that fact. We kind of miss things sometimes. We're great at monitoring things, but what's the point of monitoring decline if we never change it? So I started with a wonderful outfit called Landlife in Liverpool, this was a community centre in Lark Lane, which is an old police station. So our address was the old police station in Lark Lane, fittingly, in Liverpool. And from this, the organisation grew. They set up a housing co-op. So it was a very different kind of conservation organisation, because it came literally from a housing association where people lived. And this seems most timely because now the United Nations, I'm very conscious this is linked to United Nations youth celebration, really, that they, at a very senior level, have declared that Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is sustainable cities and communities, is probably the most important of all of them in delivering all the other sustainable development goals, all 17 of them, because it's how it links particularly to people and their communities. So our experience was really bringing nature into the city, and this, I wasn't there at the beginning. It was set up in 1975 by a lovely group of students, and I joined sort of 15 years later, and we became famous for doing these kinds of projects. This is in Kirby, on the edges of Liverpool, and also it's the philosophy of putting things in people's attention. Now, this picture is by an artist called Jamie Reed, who originally spectacularly did a lot of the artwork for the Sex Pistols and other pop groups. But this is a piece of art I really like, and believe it or not, this is apparently what inspired Danny Boyle to do that very rural opening for the Olympics in 2012. It was kind of placing nature in the middle of a stadium. And in a way, my connection with the Eden Project now is in a way that kind of focus. How do you put that kind of idea in people's minds about what's possible? So that's very much where we're coming from, really. And going back to a couple of quotes from Van Gogh, and we've been looking at, for example, road verges quite a lot recently. He said normality is a paved road. It's comfortable to walk on, but no flowers grow on it. And so much of our landscapes that surround us are pretty dull, really. But he also said in his letter to his brother, this a tremendous quote. It's been, for a long time, it's been my great desire to do a sower. What remains to be done is the sower with colour and in a large format. And many conservation organisations talk about, land scale conservation, but it is about this translation and energy and linking it to people, and that's where the seed is so important. This is areas we did when I first was kind of 3 years ago when I started working on the Eden Project main site. It was about changing their entrances and approaches. So and you'll see quite a few pictures of annuals as I talk through this set of slides. But annuals are actually very important in opening conversations, and in terms of where you take people, but also how you can begin with flowers that flower in year one, but also in terms of what follows after, in terms of what you sow at the same time. So this next picture, that area again on the verges, on the entrances to the Eden Project, that was cornfield annuals the year before. So it just shows how you can lead with something. Sown seed, so very, very cost effective in terms of cost per meter squared, but also in terms of beginning to build a spectrum of different landscapes. But sorry, just going back to the annuals, like John Rodwell, who's architect of the UK's National Vegetation Classification, made it very clear to me that we shouldn't be worried about people saying, oh, these are just annuals. These species, in terms of together, things like cornflower and corncockle, and these habitats are actually amongst the rarest in Europe. So they have importance themselves in terms of their rarity, but also in terms of their splendor. And we shouldn't forget that. But it's also how you use them as a conversation opener in conservation terms. That's very important. Good verges. Now, this is something that I think through the lockdown has become noticeably very important. And I want to say at the beginning too that I'm talking a lot about sowing, but it's also about keeping what's good and managing your assets in a very special way. So we mustn't forget that. And I was very pleased to provide Trevor Dines actually at Landlife, an organisation I've been involved with for a long time. Actually, it was how we can demonstrate this kind of parallel track between good management and sowing. because management is critical in the longer term of areas you sow, obviously, and that's why skills development and logging and creating new best practice for how these areas are looked after in green spaces, whether it be in the countryside or in the town, is really very important. So, for example, like good old dandelions at a particular time of year, if they're allowed to flower, are an extremely important nectar source, and all these elements should enter into the spectrum of ecological management and what we would call creative conservation, and really putting it in public realm as well, in terms of just being able to get this in away from the fact. When I first started in this subject area, a term that probably isn't as well used now, we used to speak about green deserts, and still that's very true. A lot of our landscape formulas, and they can actually be, again, I referred to Cheshire, be very green, but actually have very, very little value. So that is a very important thing to note. Going back to the sowing, I think, and we've had some wonderful fun sowing with large groups of people in different locations, and a lot of that's been in Merseyside and the northwest, but also in Cornwall on the China Claylands. We did some huge showings actually with community groups in Cornwall some 15 years ago, which were fantastic. And I don't think you can get over this kind of reacquainting with sowing as an activity, particularly when you make sure that people celebrate the benefits of what they've done. I remember many years ago somebody telling me how awful it was that children very often, when they planted a tree, very often never ever saw that tree again in their whole lives. They were probably whisked away to a place and planted a tree. And it's important that people come back and celebrate and reap the rewards of their labors. And this was another one actually last year, which is now in its second year, which has become a much loved site in Seaforth in northern Liverpool. But you can see the number of people involved on that sowing, and very simply advertised, and we celebrated. If you like, we played the seed in and make these events very special. But we really had no idea how many people would turn up on that evening, and it was something like 150 people. Extraordinary, and it lives in people's memory yet, in terms of them coming back and witnessing the flowers in flower, that was the first year after sowing. And again, make the point that cornflower is practically extinct in the countryside. Poppy is able to bounce back, but very often doesn't get a chance. But there you can see that it's very dramatic. And this year, in terms of public responses, particularly through the lockdown, people were, the stories are amazing in terms of, elderly people who hadn't been able to get out for 20 or more weeks, literally come into this park for the first time and literally sort of crying on the side of the field, because it was such an emotional reawakening for them to be out in a spectacular landscape, which in truth was actually fairly easy to deliver on a large scale. Something I'm going to talk about as well is the importance of soil and substrates, which becomes critical for the longevity of how wildflower landscapes last. And this site in Anfield represented working with demolition waste. So you can see the top picture there, which I've probably got a closer picture further down on the presentation. But this is was a screened brick rubble that was completely weed free, but was actually very, very good sowing medium. So we worked with the demolition contractors, and this represents a very practical way about how you can link in with recycling, waste management, and the circular economy within areas. So, and actually using topsoil, which is often not a great, it can be too rich, make it very difficult to manage in terms of, it means you have to, visit more times with the mowing machine. Biodiverse landscapes actually do better in poorer substrates. So this is, a little bit of a counterintuitive thing for many horticulturists, but it's a fact in terms of ecology. So it's important to get these messages across. It's also important to recognize the wonderful energies you can find in a community. And this school in Anfield has been extraordinary in turning heads nationally in terms of capturing the imagination of Prince William and changing actually the policies of, or launching, for example, an Iceland campaign for backyard nature. A wonderful school who are firmly embedded in sustainable development principles, really extraordinary. And we're involved in a sowing, which was featured on Prince William's special, which featured children from that school who identified a local park and, exclaimed that they wanted to change it. And, this was the result, really. Excuse me. So a wonderful local energy in terms of ambition, and giving children the confidence that can, result in something. So helping them on the basics of good ground preparation and sowing, and of course them really being enjoying the sowing and celebrating afterwards, which, if you saw that Prince William program, which they did, and really changed people's attitudes in terms of the locality, and great significant sea change in terms of the local council, understanding that people really want these landscapes. I remember when I first started, council supervisors all across the country would very often just say people didn't want this kind of thing. And that's, I don't think it's ever been true, actually, in terms of how things are presented. It's about showing things are cared for and not neglected. But I think from my experience, people have always wanted this. If you present it in the right way, in the right places, as part of often, very densely housed communities. So it shows it's across the board. Nature knows no boundaries, and we can make the most of it. Oops, sorry. Another amazing school with incredible ambitions is St. Vincent's Blind School, blind and sort of sensory school in Liverpool. Have got a great project called Reclaim the Green, and produced an incredible vision in terms of what they want to do in terms of representing ideas to the UN Youth Climate Summit, which they've also been involved in circulating this video, which has an incredible piece of music at the end, which I can share the link with and make sure you can hear and listen to. But incredible ambition, and that you can start to connect these groups. And both these schools, the headmasters of these two schools, have an incredible relationship in terms of sharing their experience with SDGs and how they can change things in their locality and elsewhere, which is important in sharing those ideas with other people, and training, students at the blind school, training other people and other blind schools around the world in similar activities, which is fantastic. I put this slide on because I've actually been talking to one of these people on the telephone today, which is the guy on the upper right-hand corner, which is Fergus Garrett from Great Dixter, which is a great East Sussex garden. And we had very early contact when the Wildflower Centre opened 20 years ago with Christopher Lloyd, who wrote this with Fergus Garrett, this great book actually on meadows. But one thing we learned from him, and meadows are actually a big part of their garden now, as in many ways quite a formal and creative garden, was Christopher Lloyd believed in being bold. And I think this is really important now in conservation terms, which you can touch on a bit later. But, you know, it's a wonderful thing to show what's possible and what you can do. And, you know, so locally in Suffolk, in Sussex, sorry, that it's a wonderful resource in terms of witnessing the contrasts of formal and imaginative gardening, both in vegetable gardens and in terms of saving wildflowers in the locality when she was a young woman, and the origins of that combination of actually of a Gertrude Jekyll garden and a Lutyens house. So an amazing asset for the county. And I mentioned sustainable development goals, but I think it's interesting that local authorities are beginning to grasp that, you know, these are really important concepts. And, you know, I mentioned SDG 11 as being particularly significant in passing on these, you know, linking all these things together. Now, I show you now some pictures. This is a picture taken in Everton in the 1960s when there was mass demolition in this part of Everton. And it's extraordinary, really. Excuse me, that this was one of the most populated parts of Liverpool at this particular time. And it then went through two series of demolition, first in the 60s, but also then later in the 80s and 90s, when the tower blocks, where people were rehomed after, you know, this kind of 60s first set of demolition, and in many ways now regretted in terms of the way that communities were lost. But also a second series in the, like I said, the 90s, which meant you know, the second set of tower blocks where people, you know, the lifestyle proved impersonal, and it didn't equate to that vision of living in the sky, really. But what was left was actually Everton Park, and we've had a wonderful experience, and actually won Kew Gardens in 2015 had a competition for England's wildflower flagship, and we entered a voting campaign, or rather we won a bidding campaign to build England's wild flagship, actually between Liverpool and Manchester, in a project we called The Tale of Two Cities. And it was about this kind of grand change in landscapes that had become disconnected with people. And we marked that, as you can see, by actually ceramic houses, which represented, made by local children, which represented the you know, the history and marked the wildflowers. In some cases, actually marked the street lines of you know, old streets. You know, the wildflowers were sown and where old streets would have been. But it was the witness of this kind of transformation in terms of what's possible that we believe is very important. And is this seeing is believing? And again, this started with annuals, but developed through, you know, in terms of what we sowed with, in terms of meadow areas. You can see the cowslips appearing on the banks where poppies had been like 2 years before. But it's this wonderful way of building up through not always very complicated mixtures of wildflowers, but having a a strong sense of ecology in terms of, you know, our experience in doing this, but making a dramatic change. Now I show this slide because this year we had some really dramatic displays of Viper's bugloss, which is Echium vulgare, and reading through actually Richard Maybe's Flora Britannica, I came across this amazing quote which said Linnaeus, you know, is the founder of biological classification 100 years before Darwin. One of the plants he was most enthusiastic about in his life, he said the fields of Echium were, you know, surpassed in splendor anything that can be imagined, and it is one of the most extraordinary plant pollinators, you know, in terms of visits by bees and things. But you know, these incredible fields we had in Everton this year, and it's something that people are now talking about, these purple hazes in Everton Park, which is this park where there'd been these mass demolitions. So it, you know, it just shows how it relates to passion and a sense of, you know, what great botanist himself raved about, and we forget this personal impact of nature, I think, which perhaps the virus has taught us a little bit about, and the way these places can become very special. But it is this thing about people mattering in the equation, and then in a way creating a movement of possibility and change which connect to these landscapes in very personal ways. And this was just a, you know, another part of the city, you know, just a very, you know, warm picture, not set up in any way, of people connecting with these landscapes. Another great phrase by an American folk singer is, all you can sing about is what you have seen. If people don't witness these landscapes, they won't expect that they can happen. And our belief is transformation in terms of what is possible, but also about sharing the knowledge we have to make that practical. And it's great when, you know, communities can visit other places and see it for themselves, and then get that idea that it doesn't seem so far away. It can happen next year. We've also believed on, you know, doing things on kind of unlikely places, and so this was something we really liked, the idea you can practice the best of science on street corners, in terms of where things are very visible. But it does go back to very good applied science, and this is a picture actually of the late Professor Tony Bradshaw, Fellow of the Royal Society, who was in this country and the world actually a father of restoration ecology, and actually represents another great link, long link between Liverpool and Cornwall, in terms of he spent a lot of time demonstrating what was possible and what other people thought was, you know, impossible sowing mediums like Cornish china clay waste. And, you know, Tim Schmidt, the Eden Project, has been very clear in saying if it hadn't been for this man, Tony Bradshaw, there wouldn't have been an Eden Project, because he made it possible for the people to think what they could do in a derelict china clay pits in Cornwall. And it was Tony actually was one of the very first few people with Tim Schmidt when he was considering the Lost Gardens of Halligan project. So that's, again, that sense of the possible from what seems like a very, very difficult scenario. Tony Bradshaw there at the Eden Project actually putting in a flag about what had inspired him, and it was actually these plots in Rothamsted, which I don't know if many people know about, but are the oldest biological experiment in the world, and demonstrate that actually the richest, there were a series of, you know, experimental plots which were given different treatments of fertilizers, particularly, and it's the plots that have had no fertilizer over a 160 plus year history now that are the most rich in biodiversity. So it was this place as an experiment that had inspired Tony Bradshaw, and we shouldn't forget these wonderful sources of science and knowledge. The man in the red woolly hat there was actually, this was the celebration of the park grass plots, the 150th birthday in about 10 years ago, actually. And Philip Grine is another fellow of the Royal Society, founder of like plant strategies studies, which again make this very point that most biodiversity will be in areas which often are very poor. So that can be rocky soils, stony soils, chalky soils, demolition waste, all kinds of things which we should use to our advantage. Again, putting things in places where this is Dale Street in Liverpool, but and there's the good old Anfield site, a bit closer up there, just showing how carefully this ground was prepared by a demolition contractor. And an iconic place. And interestingly enough, that those areas won huge admiration from the local churches and community in that area, and also set a precedent what you could do with what they call meanwhile land, which is land that doesn't will one day be developed. And we had these patches for something like 4 years before some of them were built, schools and other projects were built. But rather than just hoarding these areas off, we actually did these projects at a third of the cost. Previously, they were just going to put down grass and just mow the grass and have amenity grassland for 4 years, and this is what happened instead. I've seen that one. And again, the pictures of Everton. We had a postcard with this, which was captioned "Everton or Provence," which just makes people think, it's possible. Central Manchester, because we did the project between the two cities. This was a roundabout in central Manchester, which again shows in the space of 2 years how you can have something that's very, very special. Also about linking people. So we linked groups and children and project work between the two cities, historically very competitive, but it was wonderful to use Wildflowers as a bridge in terms of friendship as well between children who were doing similar projects in both cities, and they had an exchange of wildflowers from each of their cities as a posy, if you like. It is about how you play your hand. We've talked about in the past, the poker hand, and what I would like to say is, is how you use your resources. So very often, that we're all used to kind of the fact that, particularly for charities and wildlife trusts or whatever, the project funding is very limited. But literally, some of our best and most creative projects have been done with very, very small budgets, which I think is quite satisfying. Show this because it's a picture from 1968 in Paris, but the great phrase that came from that was "under the pavement, the beach." And this is interesting. It was interesting that the flowers in the hat, it's hard not to smile, isn't it, really? But it is this idea of the soil beneath the beach, and this shows you a very long-lived project which is still there 20 years later. And we took away the topsoil, sold the topsoil, and sowed a fairly simple mixture, but including some interesting species on this land, again on the edge of the city. But very, very soon it became very rich and diverse. And this species, Devil's Bit scabies, is seen as literally a real flagship for for meadows. And we had the UK Grasslands Forum here a few years ago, who were astonished that we could say this was a project that actually cost nothing, because it was the sale of topsoil that paid for the project. But it probably is the best created grassland in the country. But it was, for example, the Devil's Bit scabies, there was only 10 grams of seed sown. So we rely a little bit on chaos theory and the opportunity of nature, but something extraordinary can happen. And again, you know, pollinators and other elements are dramatic, but beautiful. And people in the locality actually refer to that as Liverpool lavender because of the purple haze there. So a different kind of purple haze to the bugos. But there is really a massive opportunity to design with substrates and materials, not just the subsoils. And I note that Sussex is very special because you've got chalk, which is a wonderful asset in itself. And it should be noted that, you know, the densest species diversity of chalk grassland, good chalk grassland, is the highest. You know, it's 36 species can be supported. But we should be using these opportunities to our advantage. This was our original site at the Wildflower Centre in Knowsley, and just again trading on advantage. And you know, using those landscapes to maximum effect in the delivery. And it again, the landscapes were the cheap part of the National Wildflower Centre. It was the buildings and other elements that weren't. But these areas were really cheap and fantastic, but also capture carbon, and that's something, you know, which is immensely important for the future. And we've been persuading the city and others, you know, using they're taking the concrete of this flyover, and we want to use that concrete to make carbon capture meadows, because again, the calcareous substrates literally suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Obviously, we should get people involved in the witnessing the plants, becoming familiar with them, perhaps even inventing new names for flowers. We did a little bit of that with Robert McFarlane, who's a wonderful writer. But we have lists of wildflowers and English names, which are wonderful. But why can't we have new ones to recapture the imagination? Again, connecting cities in Cornwall. I mentioned that sowing on the China clay waste previously. And just delight and celebration. This is James Lovelock, another great British scientist who is actually 102 now, I think, who mentioned, as an atmospheric scientist, because he designed the electron carbon capture device that they sent to detect life on Mars. Also, incidentally, was responsible for detecting the ozone hole. But James Lovelock said that one of the best things he thought we could do for climate change was to bury carbon as a permanent source in the soil. And this really hasn't been explored enough. But again, it could be part of the way we prepare soils and preparation for meadows in accentuating that carbon capture ability, which in many cases is actually, people often don't believe it, but meadows can capture more carbon than trees, and evidence is emerging from places like Norway and California that is the case. But there should be a mosaic of carbon capture, which isn't just about planting trees, and I think that's very important to get across. But in burying soil, and again, this idea of under the soil, under the pavement, the beach, we've been involved in quite radical soil inversion work, which brings the subsoils to the surface, because you can't always strip the soil off the land, and because topsoil is obviously a very important resource. But we demonstrated with the Woodland Trust, particularly, there are very different ways to plant trees, and we proved this across the country. This one is in Yorkshire. But rather than planting trees in a very regimented way, we can be much more creative about how we do this. This is a site we did in Cheshire. But how many sites, woodland planting sites, can you think of that would, and this in the first year again was a field of cornfield annuals, and you couldn't see the very, very tiny trees. But now, this is a picture about 6 years ago. You can see it's full of wildflowers, and bluebells are appearing for the first time. We only sowed 100 grams of bluebells over 16 acres, and they're popping up everywhere now. So it's that sense of the possible, but it's also convincing people there's a different way of doing things, even planting trees. And that's where there's a really fascinating connection with some of the wilding energies that are about at the moment. And particularly the fact that you don't always have to plant trees. It's, they can colonize and arrive of their own accord, really. So it's nice to give the helping hand as well in terms of linking the flowers to the trees. Things like, violets and other things. Same technique applied to Heathland. Some of these sites we did in Prees Heath in Shropshire. This site previously had been a potato field, and 10 years later, the picture on the left is dramatic heathland. We did something like 20 hectares, and is now exploding populations of studied silver-studded blue butterflies, which there was a rare local colony, and this habitat creation has dramatically changed that. So the point is, again, you can do something in short spaces of time, and it is possible. And this is now up by the Heathland specialists are considering this as a special scientific interest at 10 years old, which would be really something if it happens. We really hope it does, because it does break the mold and show that you can change things. It's about harvesting seed too, and again we've taken combines to unlikely places, and this year our new combine has been down in Cornwall and up here in the north, harvesting seed, so we can multiply what's possible from seed resources. Really, that's a simple thing to say. Getting near the end, but I mean, it is about, this is a Picasso quote. We do like the connections to art and creativity, but the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. We have to pass these things on to other people. We must share ideas about the exciting topics like hopefully I've given you an insight to. But it's also about the times we're in. It's very depressing, mental health, and changing landscapes. This was a central reservation in Liverpool, which previously had been just a very dull green corridor, and again has been a special part of changing gateways in terms of visible spaces, which is exceptionally important right now. And I think the world is watching. I think if we aren't doing something now and demonstrating the scale of what can be done, and thinking back to 70 years of nature conservation and monitoring decline, we should be reversing that and monitoring expansion and change, and responding to the climate emergency in such a positive way. So at that point, I think I'd like to stop, and I'd be very pleased to take questions. But what I'd like to get across is just this sense of what is possible by creative conservation and how exciting it can be, whether it be rural circumstances or urban circumstances. It's just really important.
Richard, thank you. That was really interesting, but I'm afraid we might not have time for questions right now because we've got another talk coming up. Okay. But hopefully anyone can email you at the National Wildlife Centre if they have a question.
Cool. Yeah, please just ask Scott@edenproject.com. That'd be great. I'd be very pleased to answer anybody's questions. And please, if we can find ways of passing these things on and in reflection, I'd be very, very happy to help you. And I know there's big ambitions for what's possible in Eastbourne and the rest surrounding area.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.